It was a cold, rainy afternoon in the bustling city, the kind of day where the streets were slick with water, and people hurried past each other without a second glance. Inside the grand lobby of the First National Bank, the air was warm, filled with the soft hum of conversations and the occasional beep of ATMs. The bank was one of those old, prestigious places with marble floors, high ceilings, and tellers behind polished counters that screamed money and power. Standing in line at one of the ATMs was a young woman named Emily. She couldn't have been more than 25, but she looked worn beyond her years. Her clothes were old and faded, a threadbare coat that had seen better days, jeans with patches on the knees, and shoes that were scuffed and wet from the rain. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she carried a small, worn backpack that held everything she owned in the world. Emily had been on her own since she was 18, after losing her parents in a tragic car accident. She bounced from job to job, shelter to shelter, always scraping by, but never quite breaking free. Today, she had come to the bank for a simple reason: to check her balance. She had just received a small deposit from a temporary gig cleaning offices, and she needed to know if it was enough to cover a cheap motel room for the night instead of sleeping on the street again. Her heart pounded a little as she waited her turn. Money was always tight, always a worry. Behind her in line stood a man who couldn't have been more different. His name was Richard Harrington, a self-made millionaire in his late 40s. He was dressed in an expensive tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that probably cost more than Emily's entire wardrobe. His watch gleamed under the lights, a Rolex that shouted success. Richard had built his fortune in real estate, flipping properties and developing luxury condos. He was known in business circles as ruthless, someone who stepped on anyone in his way to get ahead. But what few people knew was that Richard had a darker past, one tied to arrogance and a mistake he'd buried deep. Richard glanced at his phone impatiently, sighing loudly. The line was moving slowly and he had a meeting with investors in an hour. When he looked up, his eyes landed on Emily. He smirked to himself. Look at this ragamuffin, he thought. Probably here to beg for handouts or withdraw her last $5. People like her were a drain on society, in his opinion. He prided himself on being self-made, pulling himself up from a modest background, though he'd conveniently forgotten how much luck and cutting corners had played a part. Finally, it was Emily's turn. She stepped up to the ATM, inserted her card with trembling fingers, and punched in her PIN. The machine whirred and she selected check balance. But something was wrong. The screen froze for a moment, then displayed an error message. Unable to process. Please see a teller for assistance. Emily's face fell. She tried again, but the same thing happened. Frustrated and a little embarrassed, she turned around and said softly to the line behind her, "Excuse me, does anyone know if these machines are acting up today?" Richard, who was next, rolled his eyes dramatically. He stepped forward, brushing past her roughly. "Move aside, sweetheart," he said loudly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Some of us have actual money to manage." A few people in the lobby glanced over, but no one said anything. Emily stepped back, her cheeks burning red. "I just wanted to check my balance," she murmured, almost to herself. Richard barked out a laugh as he inserted his own card. "Check your balance. Honey, with clothes like that, your balance is probably zero or negative." He chuckled again, louder this time, drawing more attention. "Go on, tell us all how much you've got. I'll spot you a 20 if it's under $10. The lobby went quiet. A couple of tellers exchanged uncomfortable looks, but Richard was a VIP client. His accounts held millions, so they stayed silent. Emily stood there, humiliated, tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't one to cause a scene, but something inside her snapped just a little. "It's not funny," she said quietly. "I just need to see my balance." Richard turned to face her fully, his ATM transaction forgotten for a moment. He looked her up and down, smirking. "Oh, come on, lighten up. It's obvious you're broke. Why pretend otherwise? People like you always want handouts. Just admit it and move on. Emily swallowed hard. You don't know anything about me. And I don't want to, Richard shot back. Now if you'll excuse me, I have real business. But just then one of the bank managers noticed the commotion. Her name was Mrs. Lawson, a kind older woman who'd been with the bank for decades. She approached cautiously. Is everything all right here? Emily spoke up first. The ATM isn't working for me. It says to see a teller. Mrs. Lawson nodded sympathetically. Of course, dear, come with me to the counter, we'll sort it out. As Emily followed her, Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for others to hear. Yeah, sort out her zero balance. More snickers from a couple of bystanders. Emily's hands clenched into fists, but she kept walking. At the teller counter, Mrs. Lawson had Emily hand over her card. The teller, a young man named Tom, swiped it and typed into his computer. His eyes widened slightly, but he kept professional. One moment, he said, then called Mrs. Lawson over. Mrs. Lawson leaned in, looked at the screen, and her eyebrows shot up. She whispered something to Tom, then turned to Emily with a gentle smile. Miss, could you come to my office for a moment? This might take a private discussion. Emily nodded, confused. Richard, who'd finished his transaction and was lingering nearby, curious despite himself, overheard and chuckled again. Private discussion for a balance check. Must be overdraft fees piling up. But something in Mrs. Lawson's expression made him pause. She was looking at the screen again, and her face had gone pale. In the manager's office, Emily sat down nervously. Mrs. Lawson closed the door and sat across from her. Miss Thompson, Emily, is it? There's something you need to know about your account. Emily frowned. Is it bad? Did I get charged for something? Mrs. Lawson shook her head slowly. No, dear. Quite the opposite. 6 months ago, a large trust fund was deposited into this account. It was set up years ago, but only activated upon certain conditions being met, specifically, upon the passing of the trustee. Emily stared blankly. Trust fund? I don't have any family left. My parents died with nothing. Mrs. Lawson took a deep breath. The trustee was a man named Harold Jenkins. He passed away recently. In his will, he left everything to you, his sole heir. Emily's world spun. Who is Harold Jenkins? I don't know anyone by that name. Mrs. Lawson pulled up some documents on her computer. Harold Jenkins was your biological grandfather. Your mother was his daughter, but she ran away young because of family conflicts. He spent years searching for her, and after she passed, he found you through records. He was a very wealthy man, owner of several companies. He wanted to make amends for not being there. Emily's hands shook. How much? Mrs. Lawson turned the screen toward her. The balance read, $52,347,891.42, and growing with interest. Emily gasped, tears streaming down her face. That's impossible. It's real, Mrs. Lawson said softly. And there's more properties, stocks. You're a multimillionaire now, Emily. Back in the lobby, Richard was about to leave when Mrs. Lawson emerged with Emily. Emily's eyes were red from crying, but there was a new strength in her posture. Mrs. Lawson cleared her throat and addressed the lobby. Unusual, but she felt it necessary. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the earlier disturbance, but I want to clarify something. This young woman, Miss Emily Thompson, has just discovered she is the beneficiary of a substantial inheritance. Her account holds over $50 million. The lobby fell dead silent. Richard froze mid-step, his face draining of color. Mrs. Lawson continued, looking directly at Richard. And to the gentleman who was less than kind, perhaps a lesson in humility is in order. Richard stammered, she can't. But Emily stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tears. You laughed at me. You judged me without knowing anything. You called me broke, worthless. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish. He recognized something now, the name Thompson. Years ago, in his early days climbing the ladder, he'd been involved in a shady real estate deal. He'd outbid and undermined a small investor named Harold Jenkins, forcing him to sell properties at a loss. It had ruined Jenkins financially for a time, and Richard had bragged about it in circles. But Jenkins had rebuilt quietly, amassing even more wealth in secret. And now, this girl was his granddaughter. Richard's mind raced. If word got out about his past actions toward her grandfather, his reputation, his deals, everything could crumble. Investors hated scandals, especially ones involving screwing over families. I didn't know, Richard mumbled. Emily looked at him coldly. No, you didn't. You just assumed. Like you assume about everyone you think is beneath you. But this wasn't the end. Emily wasn't vengeful by nature, but the humiliation burned. Over the next weeks, as she adjusted to her new life, with lawyers, financial advisors, and a whole new world opening up, she learned more about her grandfather's story. Harold had mentioned Richard Harrington in his private notes, the man who'd nearly destroyed him out of greed. Emily didn't go nuclear at first. She started small. She bought the building where Richard's flagship condo development was planned, quietly, through shell companies. Then she delayed permits, legally, of course, citing environmental concerns that her new team of experts uncovered. Richard's project stalled. Investors pulled out when delays mounted. His net worth began to dip. Then came the family karma. Richard had a daughter, spoiled and entitled, much like he'd been to Emily. She threw tantrums when money tightened. His wife, who'd married him for wealth, started talking divorce. One day, Richard found himself at a charity event, humbled, trying to network. Who should be the keynote speaker? Emily Thompson, now dressed in elegant attire, sharing her story of rising from nothing and the importance of kindness. Richard approached her afterward, apologetic. Miss Thompson, I was wrong, terribly wrong. If there's anything I can do. Emily smiled faintly. There is. Reflect on how you treat people, and maybe donate to shelters for the homeless. I know a few good ones. Richard did. His empire shrank, but he changed, slowly, painfully. He became a quieter man, volunteering, remembering that day in the bank. Emily, meanwhile, used her fortune wisely. She set up foundations for orphans, scholarships, and programs to help people like her former self. She found peace, knowing her grandfather's legacy lived on, not just in money, but in justice. And that's the thing about karma. It doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shows a balance on a screen and lets the truth do the rest. Years passed. Emily built a life she never dreamed of. She traveled, studied, and even fell in love with someone who saw her for who she was, not her wealth. But she never forgot that day in the bank. Richard, he lost about half his fortune in bad deals and legal fees from the delays. But the real loss was his arrogance. He wrote a book anonymously about humility, donating proceeds to charity. Some say it was his way of atoning. In the end, a simple request, I just want to see my balance, changed everything. It exposed cruelty, delivered revenge without a single harsh word from Emily, and reminded the world that you never know someone's story. So next time you see someone struggling, think twice before judging. Karma has a way of balancing the scales.